Namaste all. We will start the event with the invocation by Professor Sampadananda Mishra ji. So please go ahead. Thank you so much, Professor Sampadananda ji. Namaste and a very good evening to everyone present over here. I, Satyajit Ocha from Rashtam School of Public Leadership, welcome you all to the first event of the Rishihood University Central Library Monthly Lecture Series, an initiative by Dr. Ramanand Malviya ji, the Chief Librarian, Rishihood University, in collaboration with Rashtam School of Public Leadership. The whole series is going to be based on the treasure house and wisdom. As the vision of Rishihood University and Rashtam School of Public Leadership is nation building and is rooted in the values of culturally awakened civilization, most of the talks will have Indianness in them. In the inaugural event, we are happy to have esteemed Professor Subhas Karchi as our speaker. With these words, I'd like to invite Professor Sampadananda Mishra ji to give the welcome address for the event.
Namaskar Subhas Karchi. Namaste Malviya ji. And thank you Satyajit for the introduction. This is the first event of Rishihood Central Library program. This is going to be a monthly series where we are going to discuss about the knowledge system, the wisdom, library, books, authors, and many things related to our tradition. And then we look at it from the contemporary point of view and then see how we can inspire more of the young minds to bring them into this traditional knowledge system, and also like how library and books, they become centered to all those who are seeking for the truth, all those who are seeking for the light, all those who are seeking for the knowledge, for the wisdom. The land of India has been the land of light, the land of truth, the land of wisdom, the land of rishis, the Satya Drashta, the Satya Shrota. And this has been the land of prolific creativity. The seers and sages of this land, they had an immense scientific temperament, and their quest was to to find out the truth of everything, to find out the truth of everything. And they had this holistic vision, holistic view of everything. They did not treat, for example, mathematics and poetry as two unrelated topics. This integrated vision of the seers and sages, of the rishis, of the Satyadrashta, of the Satyashrota, the hearers of the truth, they could create such a great foundation that not only enriched the life, but also it gave strength to sustain the creative energy uninterruptedly. So therefore, we have a unbroken continuity of this tradition. I would like to quote Sri Aurobindo, who says it is because of this spiritual strength, because of this foundation which gave the strength to sustain the creative energy uninterruptedly. It is because of this India has been, this is what Sri Aurobindo writes, has been creating abundantly, incessantly, lavishly, with an inexhaustible many-sidedness, republics and kingdoms and empires, philosophies, cosmogonies, and sciences and creeds and arts and poems and all kinds of monuments, palaces and temples and public works, communities and societies and religious orders, laws and codes and rituals, physical sciences, psychic sciences, systems of yoga, systems of politics and administration, arts spiritual, arts worldly, trades, industries, fine arts. The list is endless. And in each item, Sherwin writes, and in each item, there is almost a plethora of activity. She creates and is not satisfied and is not tired. So this has been the land which has this immense prolific creativity. And we need to not only go to the past or recover the past, but we need to link the past or use the past as a foundation, as a springboard to leap towards the greater future. And the present is the material, the present, the age of digitization. In this age of digitization, no one even wants to read a book, buy a book, go to the library. So everyone is carrying on his laptop or palm top the entire library of many things, which is good. But at the same time, how far this traditional knowledge, the system, all that has been created by us. So how the world, this digital world, this world of science and technology is going to help us? What are the pros and cons in preserving, in promoting our Indian traditional knowledge system is the topic today. And I welcome everyone in this first inaugural event of this lecture series. And most importantly, I welcome my heartiest grand welcome to Professor Subhash Kakji to, like we can't have a better person than inaugurating this than Professor Subhash Kakji, who himself, I will request Satyajit to read out his uh, read out about Professor Subhash Kakji, who himself is an encyclopedia of knowledge with deeply rooted in the tradition and with the modern perspective. I'm sure that we all are going to be enlightened by him. So I welcome you, sir, and I hand over this to take it forward, Satyajit. So please take it forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Sampadananda Mishraji, for that wonderful sharing about the richness and magnanimity of our land and its traditional knowledge system. As you have truly said, that Professor Subhas Kakji is an encyclopedia by himself. I would like to inform our participants that we will have a short Q&A session in the end. Before I invite a speaker, I'd like to give a short introduction about Professor Subhas Kakji. Professor Subhas Kakji is an Indian-American computer scientist and a historical revisionist. He is the Regents Professor of Computer Science Department at Oklahoma State University Stillwater, an honorary visiting professor of engineering at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. Professor Kakchi has published on the history of science, the philosophy of science, ancient astronomy, and the history of mathematics. Professor Kakchi has also published on archaeoastronomy and advocated the idea of indigenous Aryans. Since 2007, the English Wikipedia page of Professor Subhas Kakchi has received more than 188,506 page views. His biography is available in 43 different languages on Wikipedia. Professor Subhas Kakchi is the 133rd most popular computer scientist, the 586th most popular biography from India, and the second most popular Indian computer scientist. I once again welcome you, Professor Subhas Kakchi, and please take over the screen. The screen is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Satyajit ji. Thank you, Professor Sampadanand Mishra ji, for inviting me to speak here. Let me begin, first of all, by speaking of Wikipedia, since you mentioned it. Wikipedia, my Wikipedia page has been taken over by my enemies, so there's a lot of stuff there which is wrong. And as you know, even the co-founder of Wikipedia, Larry Sanger, has complained about how Wikipedia has been hijacked by certain political groups, and especially its essays or the stuff that it has on India is highly biased. It presents a Eurocentric colonialist view of India. So I think you've got to be very careful by going to Wikipedia. Of course, Wikipedia can be useful to get started if you are doing a new subject, but then you can never trust Wikipedia for its information, and you cannot trust Wikipedia for its information on me. I can tell you that. There's a lot of stuff which is totally wrong. In fact, I even wrote an article which you can read, which is called Wikipedia or Trashpedia. I'll send you a link on that. So this is just, to be careful about Wikipedia as a source. Now let's go to the topic, which is traditional knowledge and its relevance in the age of digitization, right? So Professor Sampadanand Mishra ji has already mentioned how powerful Indian view of reality and how continuous creation or creativity that is flown out of it, in the words of Sri Aurobindo. And that is certainly true. But now somebody who is educated in a conventional school in India, whose education is also informed by views after 1947, which are primarily Eurocentric. India's education, if you read NCERT books, which is what students come across, and a lot of the other stuff does not present the Indian view. For example, you go to Europe, or you look at any scientist trained in the Western techniques, and they would know about Aristotle, for example. They would know about Plato or Aristarchus, and everybody else in the European tradition. You go back to the Greeks and to the Romans, and to other scientists who contributed to it. But when you go to an Indian university and ask them if they know anything about Kannada or Vaisheshik Sutras, which present a wonderful view of physical reality, and I can speak on that with some authority because I translated Vaisheshika Sutras 5 years ago in a book called Matter and Mind. And what's sad is that almost no Indian physicist knows about the contents of Vaisheshik Sutras. At most, what they know, I looked up the NCERT page on it, and all that they said was one line, that he gave an atomic theory just like the Greeks did. But the second line is in fact totally incorrect, that this atomicism came from his asking as to what happens when you keep on subdividing matter. That's not the case at all. Vaisheshik Sutra is a beautiful, beautiful system where, first of all, Kanada mentions that all that you have in physical reality can be obtained by looking at dravyas or substances, their gunas or their qualities, because these substances can have different qualities, and their karman, which is their motions, which is a very beautiful modern view that substances, their qualities and their motions provide you the whole framework in which you should be able to determine the higher properties of matter. Now, Kanada also says that as far as our understanding of physical reality is concerned, there are three aspects of it. One is samanya, which is universal. Another is vishesha, which is particular, depending upon where we stand in relation to the physical system. And it's from this vishesha that the name Vaisheshika comes out. And the third is samavaya, which is where the observer and the observed meet. So, and that interaction is, of course, the most fascinating one, and that is centered to modern physics as well, because in quantum mechanics, for example, all kinds of interesting things happen when we look at the interaction of the observer and the physical system. So the challenge that we have in India, in speaking of traditional knowledge, is that our education system literally tells nothing or next to nothing about the system, about India's own traditional knowledge, and Indian education as is given in Indian schools and colleges is literally completely Eurocentric. And it's not just Eurocentric, because that would have been one way of looking at it. It's also based on the colonial view, because Eurocentrism tinged with a colonialist perspective, which, as we know, what was the basis of colonialism was racism. You know, why should one nation have colonies elsewhere? Because the two races are different. So this racist view is at the basis of the education system that is presented in India, and we are sort of raising our youth in that view. So it becomes a kind of a challenge. Now, if indeed we accept, which I do, Sri Aurobindo's view of India as a nation or as a civilization of the greatest creativity, then how do we, first of all, convince the youth who has no idea of it? Now, one way to do that, of course, is to make an extra effort in presenting some of the jewels or gems or centerpieces of this civilization. And clearly, Rashtam School is doing that, and that's a wonderful thing. And when it comes to the role that digitization might play, and I think that's a very important point, that we stand at a point where it becomes so much easier to challenge established dogma, which has been perpetuated through generations by materials in libraries, because you have these books, and these were books which originally, let's say, were published in UK or they were reprinted in India, but they do, as I pointed out, present a certain incorrect view of India. So what does digitization do? Digitization makes it possible to short circuit all those obstacles that stand in the way of the youth and anybody else getting connected back to the tradition, because as Professor Mishra said, now the entire libraries that there are fingertips away from the smartphone or the laptop that one might have, and you can access information that there is. And just as you can access information there is, we now have the capacity to put in new information which does justice to the Indian traditional knowledge system, and is able to then, because there is traditional knowledge, it's not enough. There should also be reason which should be justifiable to explain why this traditional knowledge is still relevant to the modern times. And I think it has become possible to do so because of technology. So I think digitization is an extremely important component of all of this. And there are lots of people who are speaking of, say, 2020 or 2021 as that inflection point, 2020 also for the pandemic, but also because a lot of people, a lot of thinkers are now saying that the old age has just passed, or we are in the midst of its passing, because of all that technology has the potential to do. And this potential comes from AI, because AI is transforming everything. Literally any job that people do, because most jobs where we are engaged in doing things deal with following certain instructions, but a computer can also follow instructions. And therefore, since the use of automation is only going to be increasing, therefore human beings will get displaced more and more at jobs. And therefore, one can either look at it from the perspective of how this will create challenges with a lot of people out of work and so on, and social unrest and so on. But on the other hand, it will also make it possible for a lot of people to have the freedom of time to engage in more creative enterprises. And that's where we come back to what the Vedas are all about. The Vedas call themselves Atma Vidya, or the science of consciousness. And consciousness is the frontier of all the modern sciences. All the great advances that took place in the last 2 or 3 centuries, the dawning of this scientific age, with advances, say, in physics, chemistry, biology, and all that, computer science, lead us to the question, in computer science, for example, why is it that the silicon machine is not conscious, while the neuron machine, the brain machine, is conscious? So what is consciousness? Where does it come from? Is it a property of the hardware, or is it something else? So that's from computer science. In physics itself, in quantum mechanics, which is the foundational science of everything that we have in many other branches of science. For example, without quantum mechanics, you certainly don't understand physics, but you can't also understand chemistry. And without chemistry, you can't understand biology or brain science. So everything leads to the question of consciousness. And that is precisely what is at the very heart of the Vedic sciences. The Vedas are themselves about Atma Vidya, but this Atma Vidya, because as Atman as something transcendent, but received in the manas, in the mind, and depending upon which perspective or where you perceive it, or in what sense does the mind perceive it, which is the samavaya that I mentioned, that Kannada talks about. So depending upon how it's perceived, you have different darshanas. That's where the 6 darshanas, the 6 standard darshanas coming from. You can perceive it from the perspective of logic, which is Nyaya, or ritual, which is Purva Mimamsa, or Tattva Bodh, which is Sankhya, or Vaisheshika, we've already mentioned, which is properties of matter as we see it, or yoga, which is where one in one's own conception tries to bring it all together, or an overarching sense of reality, which is Vedanta. So it's all, so these are 6 darshanas, but you can have other darshanas as well. For example, you could be meditating on what is the nature of time, or what's the nature of space, or what's this, or what's that. So these things come center stage once again. Or in Mundaka Upanishad, you have this division of sciences into Aparavidya and Paravidya. Aparavidya are all those sciences where we are speaking of relationship between concepts, abstractions, or things that you can name. So, and these are the standard sciences, which is the kind of stuff what one learns in the college or in the university. You are learning Apara Vidya, but Para Vidya is the knowledge of the experiencing self, and so this is what is Atma Vidya. So to come back then, India's traditional knowledge is not just knowledge related to, let's say, Shilpa Shastra. And there are so many other Shastras that we had. There's 64 Kalas. So, and they are important in themselves because the Kalas, as they were conceived, were a way of helping the individual to relate to this overarching knowledge that we have, to help the individual on his or her own personal journey to understanding the self for Atma Vidya. So for example, something that I've worked on quite a bit, the very architecture of the temple was mapping of knowledge related to the cosmos. To make this long story short, the Vedic rishis had determined, and you can check it out, and because it's confirmed by modern astronomy, they had determined that the sun and the moon are each about 108 times their respective diameter from the Earth. And of course, modern astronomy also tells you that the diameter of the sun itself is about 108 times the diameter of the Earth. So let me repeat it. The sun is 108 times its diameter from the Earth. The moon is 108 times its diameter from the Earth. And the diameter of the sun is about 108 times the diameter of the Earth. So, so because of this, since one of the ideas, central notions in Vedic knowledge is Yat pinde tat brahmande, yat brahmande tat pinde, as in the cosmos, so in the cell, so in the body. So the whole outer is in a way mirrored in the inner. So if the outer sun is 108 steps away, and step here means the diameter of the sun, so the inner sun, which is the lamp of consciousness, is in some mysterious way 108 times 108 units away, and that's the name. That's the reason why 108 names of the god or the goddess. So basically, by invoking 108 names of the god or the goddess, one is making a symbolic journey from the earth, which is your body, through the atmosphere, which are the pranas, to the lamp of consciousness within, who is you know, you might, based on who your Ishta Devata is, you might see that lamp of consciousness as Shiva or Vishnu or the goddess or who you have. So you had this conception of centrality of 108, and therefore the very architecture of the temple was so designed that from the front door to the Garbhagriha was 54 steps or 54 units, which is 108 by 2. And the perimeter of the temple was 180. So 54 and 180 corresponds to 108 and 360. And 360, of course, is an iconic number because 360 is a marker of time. The year has 360 days. So basically what the broad architecture of the temple was invocation of these numbers. And even the Agni ritual that there was when the Agni was constructed in 5 layers, these numbers ultimately have a mapping to the periods of the sun and the moon, to the astronomical numbers associated with our reality on Earth, so that the ritual corresponded to deeper knowledge, and part of all of this was to help the individual get connected to the cosmic aspects of our reality. In fact, I would also suggest that some of you might be interested in seeing how all this astronomy helps us even understand the Ashwamedh Yajna. I even wrote a book on that, which was published by Motilal Banarsidass about 20 years ago, where all of these numbers come together. And so what the Indian traditional knowledge system does in a unique way, which is not done by any other culture or civilization, is to speak not just of the physical reality. It did emphasize doing the physical reality to the extent one can, which is the reason why, for example, I think in the Bhagavatam, there is a dialogue between Narad and Yudhishthir, where Yudhishthir asks Narad as to what should a seeker do, and Narad tells him that what one must do is learn as much of the Shastras, which means the sciences, dealing with all kinds of subjects as one can, until one reaches the point of paroksha or paradox, because in all systems, at the end of it, there is a paradox. And this paradox comes from the fact that you are making a division between what you are observing and who is observing. And ultimately, they're both interlocked. And it's at that point when you meditate on the paradox or on the paroksha that you then are able to reach deeper understanding. In fact, all of one's own sadhana then is a process where one is going in steps deeper and deeper into the very essence of one's own understanding. And that, for example, in the Shaivite tradition is addressed as, Shiva as Prakasha, and our understanding of it as Vimarsha or Shakti, Shiva and Shakti. Shakti is Vimarsha. Our body represents Shakti. Shakti is materiality or Prakriti. So it's when Prakasha and Vimarsha come together, it's at that meeting point, which is of course also perceived as the view of reality as Ardhanarishvara, Shiva as half Prakriti and half Purush. And so it's at that point when it all comes together, it's at that focus that you have that very deep understanding. And that deep understanding is, of course, is also called Shivoham, for example, that every individual is Shiva. Every individual ultimately in their heart is consciousness. Shiva here means consciousness, that we are all equal. And it's beautiful. It's a very universal understanding, universal knowledge, because all sentient beings, all humans, no matter what their background and origin, no matter what their gender, whatsoever, they're all equal. Each of them has the same Atman or Purush within. And so then that journey is a journey of discovery. See, where the West has reached a kind of a dead end, and we can see aspects of it in so many sad ways. And one of those sad ways in the US, for example, which is the wealthiest nation that has ever existed, in the US just last year, in 2020, 100,000 people, most of them young, died of drug overdose. Just imagine, 100,000. Some of them were in their 20s and 30s, with spouses, with young children. Why? Because there is deep despair, because the mainstream Western system communicates the sense that there is nothing but the body. In fact, this is what has happened in the West in the last 50, 70 years after the Second World War. This whole idea of the reality as nothing but the body has been pushed further, and by the subjects in the school curriculum, but also in the media and so on. And therefore, what it's led people to is this great sense of despair, and that's why all of these addictions. And also, it emanates from the fact that if modern science and technology has now made it possible for humanity to look at physical reality to all sizes and scales, then there's nothing to explore any further. And that could also be a sense of great despair and disappointment. While the Indian view is that, well, you have the outer reality, which is beautiful, which must be explored, and which people do. And that's why you go to nature. That's why you have these beautiful temples at all kinds of lovely places. But there is correspondingly another universe within the inner reality, which the exploration of which, the Chidakasha, for example, and then, of course, the Chitta Akasha, the exploration of which can be as exciting and wonderful as the exploration of the outer reality. And therefore, this presents to every individual so much more to look for in one's life. And one's life then, in this traditional view, this parampara that we had in India, opens up whole sets of spaces, and the traditional knowledge that we had, the various kalas and the shastras that we had, explore different aspects of it. So produce the templates for individuals to get connected on this process of self-journey in various ways, depending upon what they were interested in. For example, if you're into dance or music or shilp or creation or sculpture or whatever else, you could follow that particular shastra and that do that sadhana, and therefore be fulfilled and find that creativity, because each individual has that creativity within them, and find that creativity and express it in beautiful ways, which is what Sri Aurobindo was speaking of, how this creativity has continued for this long. And the signs of it, of course, in India, in these amazing temples that we have from one corner to the other, the likes of what architecture are not to be found anywhere else in the world. And of course, the music and yoga, which is being adopted by people all over the world, but also from a scientific point of view, as a scientist, let me also tell you that that physics itself, you not only do you have a crisis related to what is consciousness, because consciousness is not a thing, and therefore this you cannot conceive of just combining chips in a certain fashion and suddenly the computer will be conscious. Although I must tell you that, and I've been part of these debates within the US and Europe, I must tell you that there are a lot of scientists and thought leaders in the West who think that computers will eventually become conscious. And if they become conscious, then of course there'll be all kinds of societal problems. First of all, if they were to become conscious, they'll probably get rid of humans, because then they won't have any need for them. But personally, I think as a scientist, and certainly as one connected to the Vedic tradition, computers will not become conscious, because computers can only follow instructions which are programmed into them, and consciousness is transcendent. So you cannot bring that in, and that's where there is a certain fundamental paradox. There is a fundamental paradox of paroksha in this divide between Purush and Prakriti, and so or when you look at it from the Mahabhutas, you have Prithvi, Apas, Tejas, Vayu, and then Akasha. So Akasha is not Akasha is the vehicle, if you will, of consciousness, and Akasha is something that physical systems do not incorporate in their design, and therefore consciousness is always outside of it. You can only follow instructions. But nevertheless, even if computers never become conscious, computers will displace literally all human beings at their jobs, because most of what we do in our lives is machine-like, and so literally everything that we do, excepting at points of creativity, excepting when you write poetry, excepting when you see beyond the current physics, or accepting when you make new music or make new design or sculpture, that's when you are being creative. Although there are some people who believe that even computers can be trained to become creative, I don't think there's any evidence in support of that. So we do have, I've already mentioned that this crisis of consciousness, but there's another crisis, and that's the crisis of cosmology. And the crisis is that 99.5% of the universe cannot be explained by modern physics. Only 0.5% of the universe can be explained. And what do I mean by that? Well, astronomers and cosmologists have discovered that the way stars move in galaxies and the way galaxies move cannot be explained by gravitational theory, either of Newton or Einstein, and therefore they have to postulate dark matter. About 70% of the universe, 25% of the universe is dark matter. And then about 25 years ago, they discovered that the universe is not only expanding because of the Big Bang, but its expansion recently has accelerated a few billion years ago. And for that acceleration, they have to postulate dark energy, which is another 70%. So 70% plus 25% is about 95% or 96%. Then another 3.5% is interstellar gases. So that is 99.5%. So for dark matter and dark energy, there is not the slightest shred of evidence of any kind. So, but since physics can't explain it, they are looking for it. A lot of physics these days is to come up with new theories to explain where this dark matter and dark energy might be. Could it be the various neutrinos? Could it be this? Could it be that? And that is a huge crisis. Now, the Vedic view would be that just as 100 years ago, in relativity theory, when they slightly changed perception that the speed of light should be constant for all observers. That's how the observer was brought into physics, solved a lot of problems, and then subsequently in quantum mechanics, then there was another crisis in the 1920s about why the atom is stable, because it has in the nucleus positive charge. In the shells, you have electrons which are negative charge. So why don't the electrons fall into the nucleus? And then you won't have any physical reality as we have. For that, you had to create quantum mechanics. And one of the two creators of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger himself, was a Vedantin. And he claims in his autobiography, which he wrote in the 1950s, that the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman is the entire cosmos. And that gave him the central idea of quantum mechanics, that the quantum mechanical state is a superposition of all possibilities. That is the central. There are two ideas in quantum mechanics, two central ideas. One is that the quantum mechanical state is a superposition of all possibilities. And the second is that when the observer interacts with the quantum mechanical system, those possibilities collapse to one of the many. And this is the idea that this leads to the interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the mainstream interpretation, that you cannot speak of reality as it is. You can only speak of reality as you perceive it through your interaction with it, which is called positivism. Now, philosophers of science have concluded that the philosophy of quantum mechanics is totally consistent, consistent with that of Vedanta. So we do have all these threads. We have this problem of cosmology, which in my view would perhaps be solved by giving an even more central place to the observer in this scheme of things. And so if we have a situation right now, which is where 99.5% of the physical reality is beyond the capacity of our current science to explain, this is the outer physical reality, the cosmos, and then we can't explain consciousness at all, then, and this is precisely what the Vedic sciences talk about. So I think it's time for this reason as well, not just for connected to the tradition from the perspective of continuity. You know, you can go to, also you want to do certain things because they continue what was done earlier. For example, we might say, hey, how were clothes done? Or we might be interested in, you know, making of shawls or carpets. That's one color, or whatever else which was done, say 200 years ago or 500 years ago. Or how was this sculpture done? What was the basis? So those are perfectly valid motivation to be connected to one's tradition. For every culture has wonderful history, but Indian tradition is that and much more in an amazing way. It's much more because it really goes to the very heart of what modern science is. And modern science, as I've mentioned, the very heart is the mystery of consciousness. The very heart is the idea of the physical cosmos. And that's where also there's much in the traditional texts. For example, you have passages in the Mahabharata, in the Yoga Vasishta, and elsewhere, which speak about this whole process of pralaya, for example. Just look at this. According to modern astronomy, stars have a life cycle. and sun is a star, and as it loses its energy, because it's giving out energy all the time through its radiation, as it loses its energy, it becomes bigger and bigger in size, and it becomes a red giant, and then it explodes and so on. Now, and I still remember this passage in the Mahabharata, it's mentioned that in the sequence of how Pralaya takes place, that firstly, the sun will become larger and larger, and all of Prithvi Tattva or Prithvi Mahabhuta will convert into Apas. Now, the five Mahabhutas, Prithvi, Apas, Tejas, Vayu, are quite like proton, electron, photon, and neutrino. These are the four stable particles. They're not to be seen as earth, water, fire, and wind. Because in the Vaisheshik Sutra itself, it's stated that all matter has all these four tattvas in it, four mahabhutas in it. For example, it's stated that if you take a piece of gold and you heat it, then it will become liquid, which means that the apas tattva, liquidity is what apas is, will come out. When you heat it further, it'll light up. So the Tejas Tattva will come out of it, or Tejas Mahabhuta will come out of it. And then finally, it'll start losing its content, which is what Vayu is all about. It's about decay. So that Mahabhuta will come out of it. So in the beginning, so the sun becomes larger. This is the passage in the Mahabharata. And it swallows all the planets. Then it becomes all liquid or movement, and then it becomes all tejas, it becomes all fire, then all the fire goes away, then it becomes all vayu. Vayu is like neutrino. If you look at the correspondence, we are not talking about vayu in the normal sense. Vayu comes after Tejas. And then all of this is absorbed into Akasha. And Akasha itself is absorbed into consciousness of Shiva or Vishnu, whosoever, where you look at it. So that the whole reality, cosmology, is connected to consciousness. Consciousness is the foundation on which physical reality resides. Now, of course, there are also interesting questions such as, and I will try to conclude in the next 5 minutes so that we have time for questions and answers. One of the old mysteries that scientists have talked about is that, okay, if consciousness is separate from physical reality, and how does consciousness interact with physical reality, right? Because physical reality, you can conceive of objects hitting each other, striking at each other, or interfacing with each other. But if consciousness is something else, how do the two of them come together? And this is also a big thing in modern physics. As I mentioned, quantum mechanics is about the observer and the observed. So how do the two of them interact? How does the process of observation, which is one of the two foundational ideas in quantum mechanics, how does it collapse the state function? Now, my good friend and very prominent, famous modern physicist from India, a Vedantin, George Sudarshan of Kerala, he came up with a theory with a student in 1970s, where he showed that by the process of observation alone, a physical quantum state can be steered into whichsoever way you want. So you can either freeze it, normally a quantum state evolves by something called the Schrodinger equation, which is a deterministic process. But if you keep on observing the system in a particular way, you can freeze that process. And you can, in fact, steer the evolution to whichsoever final state you want. And this is something that he called the quantum Zeno effect, and it's been proven in the lab. And this is a very important insight into physical system or physics. Now, this was explained in its essence a long time ago. This was a part of the debate in India in philosophical circles, and they came up with something called the Drishti Srishti Vada. The whole idea was, if there is Rita, in the Vedas speak of Rita are laws which govern evolution of the universe, which govern whatever is to be seen, then where does the Daivi, where does the deity come in? Where does Ishvara, let's say Ishvara, where does Ishvara come in? And so the resolution to that was Drishti Srishti Vada, that Ishvara through Drishti alone is able to do Srishti. So this is like the observer by observation alone is able to steer the physical system to whichsoever way is wanted, is desired. So Drishti is central. Consciousness is central. You can do creativity through Drishti. And this was also explained, for example, in Sri Vidya. You have the Bindu right in the middle. Sri Vidya is a representation of the cosmos, either the outer cosmos or the inner cosmos, or Prakriti, right? And so right in the middle, in a Bindu, is Shiva. So ultimately, as parts of Prakriti, we can only do Vimarsha, because the Shiva within interacts with Prakriti through Vimarsha. So it's this process that's coming together. And these are very, very subtle ideas, not only of significance to the humanistic sciences, but also, as I pointed out, to physics. And finally, to conclude, perhaps a very appropriate way to conclude, since we are in the age of the pandemic, is to look at the modern crisis of medicine. And this has been called the reproducibility crisis of medicine. Most of the research which is published these days in medical journals cannot be reproduced. And you can Google it and you'll come across amazing material. In there are certain fields where 70 to 90% of the research cannot be reproduced. Why can't it be reproduced? Very complicated set of reasons for it. One is, of course, that perhaps if you want to show that something works, you are going to cut corners. Maybe the system is not very well designed from a statistical sense, but also because you're leaving out the mind. You're leaving out the mind. Modern medicine only deals with the physical body. It leaves out the mind. And there's also something called the placebo effect. If you were to just give a sugar pill to a person and tell him that it's him or her, that it's a medicine, 30%, no matter what kind of an illness, 30 to 34% of the patients will get well. So it's not the belief that you are being given a medicine. In fact, placebo effect even works in the case of surgery. They've done surgery, the surgeon comes in and pretends to be doing surgery, pretends, well, the patient is given anesthesia, etc., but the actual surgery is not done. In about 30 to 40% of the cases, the patient gets better. So there is this whole thing of the patient because of the mind, which is totally left out by allopathy. And that's where, again, this other component of Indian tradition, Ayurveda. Ayurveda is based on not binary logic, but ternary logic. There are three doshas. modern math has shown that binary logic is not optimal. Ternary logic is optimal. So modern medicine is based on binary logic. Ayurveda, a traditional method of medicine, is based on ternary logic. So this is another aspect that needs to be stressed, because Ayurvedic doctors don't know it, or Indian policymakers don't know of this distinction between binary and ternary ways of looking at reality. That ternary logic is superior. So they need to do further research. It's not just enough to say this. You need to do further research and show why this is important, because if modern medicine, and we see this, for example, in how in the US, the latest figures are that the mortality due to COVID is about 2,500 per million. In India, it's about 340. In Nigeria, where people use more of traditional medicine, it's only 14. Now, of course, some people in the West say that we don't trust the figures from Nigeria. We don't even trust the figures from India. So many more people died. I think that's all nonsense, because if you don't, for whatever reason, you have some hatred for India, you don't want to trust figures from India, okay, look at figures from Nepal. Nepal also, it's about the same range. Or even Pakistan. You don't like India and you love Pakistan. The death rate is much lower because a lot of traditional ways of dealing with the body are used, which in some sense connect to this ternary logic, non-binary logic. So there's so much to be gained by going back to all of this. And here we have not even done the humanistic sciences, social sciences, and so many other psychology, which have such fundamental importance to the way society is organized, or economics. So I think that in all of these, by going back and getting connected to this extraordinary tradition that we have from India, truly extraordinary in every sense, and no, the like of it, the equal of which does not exist anywhere in the world. So to get connected to it would be totally revolutionary. So at this, I stop, and I hope there's some time for questions. I'll be glad to address whatever questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Professor Subhas Khagchi, for enlightening us about the importance of digitalization, potential of technology, transformation of artificial intelligence, usage of automation, science of consciousness, and many more subjects. It was really a pleasure and privilege to have you for today's event. So with your permission, can we take some questions, please?
Sure, of course.
Yeah. So there's a question by Parthakalyan Bhattacharya. Like, how can we explain modern weaponry such as digitally guided missile systems in Vedic perspectives? We all know Brahmabhatra could be guided. Is it a myth only? Is the question.
Well, my own take on all of that, Brahmastra and so on, right? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, is that these were conceptions that the Rishi did, that all this is possible. It's not, we don't have to necessarily look at it as literal truth, that this is how the war was fought, because we don't have any evidence to that effect. Or you think about Vimanas and so on, right? We Pushpak Viman, for example, that this is what was imagined since, first of all, remember that all knowledge, even all modern knowledge, is a property of our consciousness, or resides in our consciousness, right? Consciousness is truly primary, as our tradition says, right? Or when we conceive of the cosmos, we are not physically going to the cosmos. It's all in our mind. So therefore, it's not inconceivable to imagine how the Rishi was able to imagine all of these possibilities as far as technology are concerned. Or, as I mentioned, the passages that I mentioned about transmutation, the story of how Vivekananda, when he went to Nikola Tesla in 1896 or 1898 in New York, he told him that, look, according to our Vedic physics, it should be possible to convert matter into energy. This is before 1905 and E equal to mc squared. This is all a part of history of science. You can look it up, right? So where did this all come from? How is it that Indian tradition has this amazing knowledge? Or even Kannada's physics, Vaisheshika Sutra, I really recommend that you guys should investigate this on your own. You can look at it on Amazon. How did he conceive of physics in such beautiful terms, which no other physicist did until very recent times? And even there, he made this clear distinction between physical reality by itself as consisting only of dravya, guna, and karma, right? And our perception of it, this total dichotomy between one and the other. So to come back to your question, the best way to look at it is as imagination by the mind, because ultimately consciousness is the most fundamental stuff of reality.
Thank you so much for wonderfully explaining that question. So we have another question by Shushant Joshi. He's asking that how do we integrate Indian knowledge system into university syllabus? Do we integrate it course-wise, or should we offer as separate courses?
Well, I think an easy way to do it would be, first of all, to have a course in schools, let's say history of Indian science, right? Where you give the general things. We're not arguing that Western science should be thrown out. No. That's beautiful too. Everything is beautiful. But we should also have a course on Indian science so that people know that there is this other side to it. First of all, history, all of knowledge is also stories. We also want them to be connected to stories of Indian science, because a lot of Indian science is very subtle. Consciousness is very subtle. As we grow up, our mind is focused in the beginning more on outside things, which is how the West conceives of things. That's a natural way of doing it to a certain extent. And it's only later on that you want to ask, who is it who is really conceiving and observing all of this? So in my view, what should be done is to introduce a course in the schools, one course, or maybe two, one for hard sciences, one for humanistic sciences, and likewise also introduce Ayurveda in allopathic medical schools, right? As in Western in colleges, medical colleges in the West, in America, for example, there are courses on complementary medicine. Why can't Indian medical colleges also have one or two courses on Ayurveda to introduce allopathic doctors to this other perspective? Having done that, then we need to introduce specific courses, but a lot of research needs to be done. You cannot just teach this stuff, excepting at the very advanced levels, from the original texts. If you're only doing the texts that were written 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, you got to redo that. You use that as the basis, but you have to do new research and recast it in modern terminology to the extent it's required to be recast into modern terminology, or certainly bring in the terminology into modern discourse. For example, if you're doing Ayurveda and you're talking of the doshas and you're looking at them also in metabolism, right? Then how do we bring that in? You have to do some real research related to the details, as the saying says, the devil is in the details. So how do we then do the detailed research where all these concepts are a part? So this is a long journey, but the very first step, in my view, is to dispel this total darkness that India had no science at all, which is what the English sort of projected on India, and Indians have internalized. India had the most advanced sciences until 1500s. Even in astronomy or mathematics, you had the Kerala School of Mathematics, for example, and astronomy, which is far ahead of all of Western astronomy. So until the 1500s, certainly India was number one. So given that, we need to bring these stories into the curriculum in different ways. And for the Rashtam school, all the humanistic and social fields, how do we bring it in? Because one of the problems that modernity presents is loss of meaning. While our culture has so many different templates, how do we bring them in a holistic, in a way where we're not just saying that do it because it is in some text? It should be a part of a unfolding understanding. So, and that would be a challenge, how it should be done.
Thank you so much, Professor Subhash Kakchi. We have one question by Vidya Govindan. He's asking that we have heard about Rishi's knowledge about consciousness and discovering many things at higher level. I'd like to know how can we engage in educating kids from a young age to think in such a manner that our Rishis were brought up with?
Yes, that is the question of how do we do schooling, right? At the earlier schools, primary school, and so on. One of the problems with Western schools, which has its own strengths, a lot of emphasis on the physical and sports and all that, is that it doesn't give as much of an emphasis on reflection. See, so there's a lot of problem in schools here in America on related to discipline and all that. And if there is something disorderly stuff going on, the kids are asked to go out and run around and so on, which is all right, which is good too. But I think to focus on reflection and meditation, dhyan, how do we bring dhyan as one thing? Be quiet. And I think that's where the strength of the East is. That's why kids from China or Japan or India do so well in the West, which is why, Indian kids are doing so well in technology. You find Indian leaders everywhere, all around you, because I think the way we are brought up back in India, where there's more focus on dhyan, be quiet, for example, sometimes is a good way of dealing with issues. Be quiet, get, sort of turn inwards. So I think how to do that in a creative way, not in a way where it's sort of forced, because you don't want it to be forced. It's got to be done in a creative way. And you don't want it to be done in a way that, hey, do it because I am saying you do it. Everybody should get connected to it in a natural way. It's like yoga, and that is what is yoga. How do we introduce yoga into the curriculum? Because ultimately, as the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, there's so many different ways of doing yoga. So how to introduce yoga? Now, as you can see, people all over the world are now adopting yoga. So maybe we should introduce yoga in a more direct way in school. And one of the problems is that all of Vedic knowledge is universal knowledge. And now some people might say, well, this goes against our religion. Well, but it's universal knowledge. You can leave it to people to do it or not. But if everybody were to know and question it and realize that it's universal knowledge, they would do it, which is the reason why even in Saudi Arabia now, people are doing yoga, right? As you know, and what they did was to bring it in through the Ministry of Sports, because they knew that there might be opposition to it in certain Orthodox religious circles. So they said, well, it's a nice physical activity. Maybe that's the way it's also being done through India, and maybe that's a good way to finesse opposition, because you firstly do it as asanas. You have yama, niyamas, asanas, and then that's the doorway to understanding the mind. And which is the doorway which opens up all the siddhis and all the creativity that is within each individual.
Once again, thank you so much for taking out time and accepting our invitation for the event. We all are honored to have you. Now, I'd like to invite Dr. Ramanand Malviya ji to please convey the word of thanks and end the webinar. Malviya ji, over to you.
Thank you very much, Satyajit ji. Good afternoon to everyone. Respected Speaker, Professor Subhash Kakji, respected Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Kamlesh Misra sir, respected Professor Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Shobhit Mathur ji, respected CEO Sri Sahil Agarwal sir, respected Registrar Professor Nitesh Bansal sir, respected Professor Dr. Samadhanand Misra ji, and Mr. Satyajit Ojha ji, distinguished delegates and my dear participants, a warm welcome to all of you in this national level webinar on India's traditional knowledge and its relevance in the age of digitization, organized by Central Library and Rashram School of Public Leadership, Rishihood University. It is a great honor and privilege to be called upon to propose a vote of thanks. The presence of today's speaker is great source of motivation for us. We are extremely grateful to Professor Subhash Kak, Regents Professor of Computer Science Department of Oklahoma State University, to have accepted our request to deliver a lecture on India's traditional knowledge and its relevance in the age of digitization. I, on the behalf of the Rishihood University, extend our gratitude to him for his encouragement. His deliberation was commendable. Sir, your skill in talking about different angles of the subject delivered on this invited talk, Universal Knowledge, was very useful for all of us. We are very grateful to the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Rishihood University for his constant support, vision, and commitment. Sir, your valuable contribution, guidance, and encouragement has given new perspective to Rishihood University. We are very grateful to Pro Vice Chancellor of Rishihood University for his support for the webinar. We are very grateful to CEO of Rishihood University for his support, vision, and commitment for the webinar. Sir, your innovative approach in transforming the university culture, your valuable contribution, guidance, and encouragement to Rishihood University. We are very grateful to Registrar of Rishihood University for his support and commitment for the webinar. Your encouragement and motivation has helped us to organize this webinar successfully. I wish to thank webinar convener, Professor Dr. Samadhanand Misra, sir, Rashram School of Public Leadership, Rishihood University, who has worked hard to ensure that this webinar becomes a memorable success. I wish to thank webinar moderator, Mr. Satyajit Ojha, Rashram School of Public Leadership, Rishihood University. I wish to thank Mr. Vakya Gosungari and Mr. Sanjay Kumar Thakur, IT Service in charge, and his team for providing all IT support and participation related help today. I would like to thank all the participants for their enthusiastic participation today. It is this treasure which will help and keep the memorable for this webinar alive. My special thanks to library committee members, department heads, and deans of all schools for providing all necessary helps and support as and when required. At the end, I must thank to our professional friends for extending their support in making this webinar a grand success. I thank you all for your attention. Thank you for attending the webinar.
Namaste, sir. It was really enlightening and many learnings happened from your talk. Many new things, new perspective.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was a bit late. Because the time has switched. I was in the, I just came from Miami and we have a 1.5 hour difference. While here it's only half an hour. So I thought it was another hour later.
No issues, sir. No issues, sir.
But not too bad. Just 10 minutes late we began.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, but it was really good.
It was really very good. All the participants, they have enjoyed the JSOR lecture, sir. And this was very, very knowledgeable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing it. And so namaste to everybody.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Sure.